What began as a foreign war has ended as a domestic collapse. Vladimir Putin did not just drag Russia into a military catastrophe in Ukraine, he detonated a demographic bomb inside his own country. While the world focused on tanks, missiles, and front lines, a quieter invasion unfolded across Russia's heartland, from the Ural Mountains to Siberia, from provincial factory towns to the very center of Moscow itself. Red Square tells the story better than any intelligence report. This is not symbolism, this is reality. Where Soviet marches once echoed beneath Lenin's statue, Bollywood music now plays through loudspeakers. Indian workers dance where Russian soldiers once paraded. Moscow streets, once a showcase of Slavic identity and imperial pride, are being reshaped in plain sight. This is not cultural exchange. This is replacement driven by desperation. The reason is brutally simple. While Russian men bleed and die at the front, their jobs remain empty at home. Factories need hands. Construction sites need bodies. Buses need drivers. The Kremlin answered that crisis not by ending the war, but by importing labor at an industrial scale. An air bridge was quietly established between New Delhi and Moscow, funneling tens of thousands of Indian workers into the vacuum left behind by dead and mobilized Russians. The images are chillingly familiar. Long lines outside migrant offices in Moscow look eerily similar to Soviet-era bread queues. The difference is unmistakable. This time, Russians are not waiting, Indians are. Hostels that once served domestic workers now smell of curry instead of dill. Garam masala has replaced traditional Russian cuisine, not because of choice, but because Russia no longer has enough Russians to keep its economy alive. This was not accidental. It was policy. The Kremlin set a quota of 72,000 Indian workers for 2025 alone, with projections that stretch far beyond that. Officials now openly speak of accepting unlimited numbers. When a state reaches the point where it declares its own population insufficient, the collapse is already underway. What we are witnessing is not immigration. It is the first visible crack in Russia's national survival. And this is only the beginning. What makes this situation truly dangerous is not the presence of foreign workers, but the machinery behind it. This was not an organic labor migration responding to market demand. This was engineered from the top. After the Kremlin's outreach to New Delhi, Russia's largest financial institution, Sberbank, quietly crossed a historic line. It stopped behaving like a bank and started operating like a state-run recruitment agency. Money transfers were no longer the priority. Human transfers were. Financing, logistics, housing, and transportation pipelines were constructed to ensure a steady flow of Indian labor into Moscow and other major cities. When a country's banking system pivots from capital management to workforce importation, it is a confession of systemic failure. Russia was no longer managing growth. It was plugging holes in a sinking ship. The economic imbalance only deepened the wound. Indian workers were offered salaries of roughly 100,000 rubles per month, an amount considered high by Russian standards. Converted, this exceeds $1,200. The average Russian worker, meanwhile, struggles to earn even half that. This is not competition. This is displacement. Russians returning from the front, injured or traumatized, are discovering that their jobs no longer exist, or worse, that they exist but pay less than what imported labor now earns. This reality is breeding resentment at ground level. In industrial cities across the Ural region and in Moscow's outer districts, frustration is boiling. Russians who once supported the war now watch as foreign workers fill factories and construction sites while they are told to sacrifice more. One Russian worker summed it up bluntly. He said many were told to go to the special military operation to work, and many did. Now they see Indians working full weeks, paid cheaply, while Russians are pushed aside to save money. The streets reflect this tension. Ride the Moscow metro, and the demographic shift is impossible to ignore. South Asian faces now outnumber Slavic ones in entire lines and neighborhoods. What began as silent acceptance has mutated into open hostility. Online pro-war nationalist channels once praised India and Prime Minister Narendra Modi as brothers standing shoulder to shoulder against the West. But when those so-called brothers appeared in Russian neighborhoods and workplaces, the rhetoric collapsed. Digital loyalty evaporated the moment economic reality hit home. Street fights replaced slogans. Brotherhood turned into blame. The Kremlin had unleashed a force it could no longer control, and if the influx from India cracked the dam, what followed next shattered it entirely. If India represented a demographic leak, China became the total collapse of the dam. In order to survive Western sanctions, the Kremlin handed Beijing something far more valuable than contracts or trade deals. It handed over access. Under the banner of unlimited friendship, Russia opened its borders to Chinese citizens with visa-free entry, effectively dismantling one of the last remaining tools of sovereign control. This decision was not ideological. It was economic desperation dressed up as diplomacy. Russia needed Chinese tourists to bring in hard currency, and Beijing understood exactly how weak Moscow had become. What followed was not tourism. It was occupation by numbers. St. Petersburg's famous Nevsky Prospect, once a symbol of Russian imperial elegance, has transformed into a Chinese marketplace. Megaphones of tour guides now echo louder than Russian voices near the Winter Palace and inside the corridors of the Hermitage. The images are striking and deeply unsettling. Massive Chinese tour groups move through the city, not like visitors, but like owners inspecting property. Local shopkeepers are pushed aside. Public space shrinks. Places once frequented by Russian aristocracy and intellectuals now operate on the rhythm of the yuan. This is not cultural curiosity. This is economic dominance playing out in real time. Beyond tourism, the shift is even more profound. Chinese workers have become a permanent feature in major Russian cities. From Vladivostok to Khabarovsk and Blagoveshchensk, the visibility and concentration of Chinese communities have surged. Nowhere is this more alarming than in the Far East. In Vladivostok, a city once described as Russia's ruler of the East, locals increasingly describe themselves as second-class citizens in their own land. A leaked video sent shockwaves through Russian social media. Chinese students beating a Russian cleaner. Not an isolated incident, but a symbol of a deeper collapse of authority. Online reactions captured the fear in one haunting sentence. Putin signed a decree granting Chinese citizens visa-free entry to Russia, but technically the border still exists. The unspoken question is, what happens next? That question grows darker when Siberia enters the conversation. Anxiety about control over future assets is no longer theoretical. According to intelligence reports, to finance the war in Ukraine, the Kremlin is effectively handing over access to Russia's richest lands. Nearly 40% of Russia's total territory, its forests, minerals, and resources, is increasingly tied to Beijing's economic machinery. Birch trees, red forests, centuries-old pines, all flowing eastward. This is how empires fall in the modern era. Not with invading armies, but with contracts, currency, and silent demographic shifts. Russia did not lose territory on a map. It lost influence where it matters most. And yet, even this was not the darkest layer of the story. If China represents economic domination, then North Korea exposes the moral collapse at the heart of the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin is no longer dependent solely on Beijing's money. He is now dependent on human bodies supplied by the most isolated regime on earth. The arrival of tens of thousands of North Korean workers in Russia is not labor cooperation. It is one of the largest state-sponsored human trafficking operations of the modern era. These workers are not migrants chasing opportunity. They are biological robots owned by the state. 18-hour workdays, 2 days off per month, no contracts they can read, no freedom to leave. Construction sites in Moscow and St. Petersburg are increasingly staffed by men who do not speak the language, do not control their wages, and do not own their own lives. While Putin claims to be defending Russian values against the West, he has recreated a system that mirrors Stalinist labor camps. Luxury housing projects rising in Russia's richest cities are no longer built by Russian engineers. They are erected by this shadow army. The existence of a 5,000-strong construction unit staffed almost entirely by North Koreans is not a sign of efficiency. It is proof that Russia's technical and human capital has collapsed. Even more alarming, intelligence reports indicate that these workers are being funneled into factories producing drones for the Russian military. The defense industry, once portrayed as invincible, is now dependent on forced labor supplied by Kim Jong-un. This arrangement is tearing Russian society apart. On one side stand Chinese groups with capital, purchasing influence street by street. On the other side are North Koreans trapped in misery, sometimes rebelling, sometimes disappearing. Ukrainian official Anton Gerashchenko posed the question that now haunts the Kremlin. How many of these workers will remain on construction sites, and how many will eventually be pushed toward the front lines? History already provides the answer. Russia has run this playbook before. Central Asians, Cubans, Nepalese, each wave was promised high-paying construction jobs. Each wave followed the same horror movie script. Workers arrive, passports are confiscated, documents written in Cyrillic are placed in front of them. They are told it is routine paperwork, insurance, registration, procedure. The moment they sign, their fate changes. Worker becomes contract soldier. Construction site becomes battlefield. And suddenly, men who came to earn a few $100s are standing in the killing fields of Ukraine with rifles in their hands. The evidence is no longer hidden. It is screaming at us from the front. The most devastating proof of this system comes not from official statements, but from the voices of the trapped. One Indian worker's testimony cuts through the Kremlin's propaganda with brutal clarity. He did not volunteer for war. He did not enlist. He came to work for 2 days. He labored like any other migrant. On the third day, everything changed. He was handed coordinates, not a work site, a battlefield. His words are raw and unfiltered. He describes seeing Ukrainian soldiers and realizing in that moment that he was no longer a worker, he was a disposable asset. He repeats the same sentence again and again, as if saying it enough times might save him. I am not Russian. I just want to go home. This is not the voice of a fighter. This is the voice of a civilian caught inside a war crime. And this is not an exception. It is a model, a pipeline designed to convert labor shortages into cannon fodder. The system is so greedy it swallows anyone it can reach. Education does not protect you. Skill does not protect you. Even professionals are pulled in. The story of an Iranian petroleum engineer detained during a routine police check in St. Petersburg exposes how deeply this machinery has corrupted Russia's legal system. He was offered a choice that is no choice at all: prison or the front line. Training camps revealed the final layer of dehumanization. Foreigners are segregated from Russian soldiers. Africans, Middle Easterners, Iranians, Latin Americans, all separated, poorly trained, and sent forward without even knowing how to operate their weapons. In the eyes of commanders, they are not soldiers. They are expendables. Human buffers meant to absorb fire so Russian units do not have to. The financial cruelty compounds the humiliation. While Russian citizens struggle to survive on an average monthly income that barely reaches $600, the Kremlin pays imported fighters far more. North Korean soldiers receive around $2,000 per month. This money flows straight back to Pyongyang, creating a lifeline worth hundreds of millions annually for the regime. Putin is financing foreign dictators with the blood and poverty of his own people. For Russians watching from home, the message is unmistakable. Your lives are cheaper than imported labor. Your future is less valuable than keeping the war alive for one more month. This is not governance. This is extraction. And the consequences of this extraction are now spreading far beyond the battlefield. As the Kremlin drains foreign labor into the war machine, a new fault line is ripping through Russian society from the inside. Central Asian migrants, once treated as expendable service workers, have become targets of systematic coercion. Tajiks, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz workers are rounded up, pressured, and offered a single poisoned bargain: citizenship in exchange for the front line, survival today in exchange for near certain death tomorrow. This strategy is backfiring in slow motion. Every migrant forced into uniform leaves behind an unfillable hole in Russia's economy. Construction sites stall, cleaning services collapse, public transport strains. Moscow's service sector is hollowing out because the people who kept it running are being fed into the war. Putin is sacrificing the civilian economy to keep the battlefield alive, and the cost is now impossible to hide. Detention centers like Sakharovo have become pressure cookers of resentment, inhumane treatment, arbitrary arrests, and forced military contracts are generating something far more dangerous than silence. They are generating rage. Millions of marginalized people now live inside Russia with military training, nothing to lose, and no loyalty to the state that betrayed them. This is how internal instability is born, not through ideology, but through humiliation. Ironically, even migrants who are not yet targeted are fleeing. The ruble's collapse, constant police harassment, and legal uncertainty are pushing Central Asian workers out of Russia entirely. Many are choosing Europe or other parts of Asia over a country that has become a trap. The labor pipeline that once propped up Russian cities is now leaking in every direction. Behind all of this lies a colder, more merciless force. Demographics. Russia is not just losing workers, it is losing time. Birth rates have fallen to their lowest level in 2 centuries. This is not a statistical downturn. It is an existential emergency. Even during Napoleon's invasion, World War I, or the darkest days of World War II, Russia's demographic future was never this bleak. Putin's war did not just erase a generation on the front lines. It erased the generations that were supposed to come after. The Kremlin classified the data as a state secret, hoping secrecy could mask reality. It cannot. You cannot classify empty maternity wards. You cannot censor missing children. And as the ethnic Russian population shrinks, it is being replaced by the very influx Putin claims to fear. The loss of identity he warned about is no longer hypothetical. It is unfolding in real time. The danger now moves beyond economics and identity. It strikes at the physical integrity of the Russian state. A federation can survive poverty. It can survive sanctions. It cannot survive demographic collapse paired with weakening central authority. As the population shifts and the army thins out, Moscow's grip on its vast periphery begins to loosen. In regions bordering China, the balance is already tipping. The growing Chinese population is not an invasion in the traditional sense. There are no tanks crossing borders. There are no declarations of war. What is happening is far more effective. Influence is transferring silently, street by street, business by business. Control is not seized. It is inherited by default. When local economies depend on Chinese capital, when labor markets depend on Chinese workers, and when demographics favor one side overwhelmingly, sovereignty becomes a legal fiction. This is especially true in Siberia and the Far East. These regions have always been difficult for Moscow to hold. Distance, climate, and infrastructure made them vulnerable even in times of strength. Now, with fewer Russians living there, fewer soldiers stationed there, and fewer resources allocated there, the question is no longer whether Moscow can defend these territories militarily. The question is whether it can sustain them politically and demographically at all. What Putin set out to prevent has become inevitable. He claimed the war was necessary to stop the erosion of Russian identity and influence. Instead, he accelerated both. The army that once enforced central control is exhausted and understaffed. The population that once anchored the Federation is shrinking. The replacement is fragmented, marginalized, and increasingly disconnected from the state. In this scenario, borders do not need to move on a map to lose meaning. Authority dissolves first, loyalty follows. What remains is a hollow center presiding over regions that no longer feel Russian in anything but name. This is how empires truly unravel, not with a single decisive defeat, but with a slow loss of control that cannot be reversed once it passes a certain point. And now, the final irony of Putin's legacy comes into focus. When the full picture comes into view, the irony is devastating. Vladimir Putin wanted to be remembered as a ruler in the tradition of empire builders, a modern Peter the Great who expanded territory and restored national power. Instead, his war produced the opposite result. It hollowed out the core of the state and turned Russia into something far smaller than it appears on a map. The dominoes fell in a predictable order. The war erased the productive male population. Factories lost workers. Cities lost drivers, builders, technicians. To prevent immediate economic collapse, the Kremlin opened the gates to Asia. First came Indian labor to keep the machines running, then Chinese capital and people to keep money flowing, finally North Korean bodies to keep construction and military production alive at any cost. What emerged from this sequence is not sovereignty, but dependency. Moscow now relies on Beijing's money, New Delhi's labor, and Pyongyang's forced workforce. This is not strategic partnership. This is structural submission. Russia has become a gas station for China, a labor market for India, and a labor camp extension of North Korea, all while insisting it is defending independence from Western influence. The images say more than any speech ever could. Indian youths dancing in Red Square, Chinese tour groups dominating Petersburg streets, North Korean workers standing silently on construction sites waiting for orders they cannot refuse. These are not signs of globalization. They are symptoms of a state that no longer controls its own future. Putin's sovereign Russia exists now mostly as branding, a flag, a narrative. Inside, the country has been reorganized around survival, not strength. The tragedy is not simply military defeat or economic hardship. It is the loss of agency. Decisions are no longer driven by long-term national interest, but by short-term crisis management. History will not record this era as one of expansion. It will remember it as the moment Russia quietly surrendered without a single decisive battle being fought at home. And that brings us to the final question no one in the Kremlin wants to answer. The final tragedy of this story is not invasion, sanctions, or even defeat on the battlefield. It is surrender without resistance. Russia did not fall because an enemy crossed its borders. It fell because the state hollowed itself out from within. By the time the consequences became visible, there was no force left capable of stopping them. Vladimir Putin claimed this war was about survival, about preventing Russia from being weakened, divided, or replaced. Yet the outcome is precisely what he warned against: a shrinking native population, an economy dependent on foreign labor, strategic regions drifting away not through conquest, but through demographics and money. Control lost, not with explosions, but with contracts and quotas. This is not the collapse of a regime in the traditional sense. Moscow still stands, the flag still flies, the institutions still function on paper, but power has shifted, influence has moved. The future is no longer being written in the Kremlin alone. It is being shaped in New Delhi's labor offices, Beijing's financial centers, and Pyongyang's labor ministries. The most haunting part is that this process does not announce itself. There is no single moment when alarms sound and history turns the page. There is only accumulation, one decision stacked on another, one emergency measure layered onto the next, until suddenly the country that believed itself to be eternal realizes it has already crossed the point of no return. Empires of the past fell to invading armies. Russia's collapse, if history judges it that way, will be remembered as something colder and more humiliating, a great power that traded its future for time, a state that survived each month by selling the next decade, a nation that surrendered without a final battle because there was no one left to fight it. Those Bollywood songs echoing across Red Square are not a celebration. They are a requiem, a soundtrack to a silent ending that is still unfolding. And the question history will ask is not how Russia lost a war, but whether it realized what it was losing before it was too late.